It was a quiet evening in a suburban neighborhood just outside Atlanta, Georgia. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple. A man in his mid-30s, dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie, was driving home after a long day at work. He had spent hours on his feet dealing with the usual chaos of his job, but now all he wanted was to unwind with his family. The streets were calm, almost serene as he drove along Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. It was one of those moments where everything felt normal, just another ordinary night. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. As the man continued down the road, he noticed flashing lights in his rearview mirror. Two police cars had pulled up behind him, their red and blue lights cutting through the darkness. At first, he wasn't sure what was happening. Had he accidentally broken some traffic rule? Was there something wrong with his car? He slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, turning on his hazard lights to signal that he was cooperating. His heart started beating a little faster, not out of fear, exactly, but more out of confusion. After all, he hadn't done anything wrong. What the officers approaching his car didn't know, and what made this moment so significant, was that the driver they were about to confront was no ordinary civilian. He was a decorated officer himself. Someone who wore a badge and swore an oath to protect and serve, but tonight he wasn't in uniform. To the world outside his car window, he looked like any other person cruising through the neighborhood. As he sat there waiting, the man's mind raced. He knew how these situations could go. He'd seen it happen before, not just to others, but sometimes even to colleagues who happened to be off duty. Being pulled over by fellow officers can be tricky, especially if they don't recognize you right away. And then there's the added layer of complexity that comes with being a black man in America. Even with a badge, even with years of service under your belt, certain assumptions can still follow you wherever you go, but there was one thing working in his favor tonight, a small detail that would later prove to be crucial. Earlier that week, he'd installed a dashboard camera in his car. It wasn't standard issue. It was a personal choice, something he'd picked up during his time working undercover cases. He liked having the extra security, knowing that if anything ever went sideways, there would be a record of it. Little did he know how important that decision would turn out to be. With the dashboard cam rolling, the first officer approached his vehicle. The man kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, just as protocol dictates. He watched as the officer shone a flashlight into his car, scanning the interior before speaking. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone sharp and clipped. There was no warmth, no acknowledgement of basic human courtesy. It was clear from the start that this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. The man reached carefully for his wallet, pulling out his driver's license and handing it over. Attached to the ID was his badge, a subtle yet unmistakable sign of his profession. He figured that would clear things up quickly. Surely, once the officer saw the badge, he'd realize this was just a misunderstanding and apologize for the inconvenience. But instead of easing the tension, showing his badge seemed to make things worse. The officer glanced at the badge, his expression unreadable behind the glare of his flashlight. For a brief second, it looked like he might soften, but then his demeanor shifted again. Instead of stepping back or explaining why he'd been pulled over, the officer began firing questions. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Why are you driving through this area?" The man answered calmly, keeping his tone measured and respectful. He explained that he lived nearby and was simply heading home after finishing his shift. But the officer didn't seem satisfied. If anything, his line of questioning grew more pointed, almost accusatory. By now, a second officer had joined them, muttering something about suspicious behavior. The man couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop anymore, it was starting to feel like something else entirely, and so, as the minutes ticked by, the scene unfolded with mounting tension. What should have been a quick interaction was turning into something far more complicated. The man sat silently inside his car, acutely aware of the dashboard camera capturing every word, every gesture. He couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, the kind of moment he'd heard about countless times, but never experienced firsthand, was about to reveal truths far bigger than either side could have imagined. The air felt heavy as the man sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel just a little tighter. The officer's questions kept coming, each one sharper than the last. "Where are you coming from?" he repeated, his tone making it clear he wasn't satisfied with the answers he'd gotten so far. "What's your business around here?" The man took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. He explained again that he was heading home after finishing work. He lived in the neighborhood. This was his community. But the officer didn't seem interested in listening. Instead, he leaned closer to the car window, his flashlight still trained on the driver's face. "You sure about that?" he said, almost challenging him. "Because we've had some reports of suspicious activity." Suspicious activity? The words hit hard. The man couldn't help but wonder, what exactly did that mean? Was it because he was driving through a predominantly white neighborhood? Or was it something else entirely? He glanced down at his hoodie and jeans, suddenly hyper-aware of how he might look to someone who didn't know him. Casual clothes, late at night, was that enough to raise suspicion? Before he could respond, the second officer chimed in. His voice carried a different kind of edge, colder and more dismissive. "You know," he said, stepping closer to the car, "people like you shouldn't be out here this late unless they've got a good reason." The phrase, "people like you," hung in the air, sharp and loaded. It wasn't just what the officer said, it was how he said it. The implication was clear, and it stung. The man clenched his jaw, forcing himself not to react. He knew better than to let his emotions take over. In his line of work, he'd seen plenty of situations escalate quickly when tempers flared. So instead of snapping back, he chose his words carefully. "I'm telling you the truth," he said, his voice steady, despite the knot forming in his stomach. "I live here, I work here, I'm just trying to get home." But the officers weren't backing down. If anything, their skepticism seemed to grow. One of them gestured toward the car. "Pop the trunk," he ordered, without offering any explanation. The man hesitated for a split second, then complied. He knew refusing would only make things worse. Besides, there was nothing in the trunk except an old gym bag and a spare tire. Still, the request felt unnecessary, intrusive even as the first. Officer peered into the trunk, shining his flashlight around. The second officer continued circling the car. His movements were deliberate, almost theatrical, as if he was trying to intimidate the driver into slipping up. Every now and then, he'd glance at the badge clipped to the man's ID, which was still sitting on the dashboard. You'd think seeing that badge would have put an end to the interrogation. After all, it was proof that the man wasn't just another civilian, he was one of them. But instead of easing the tension, it seemed to fuel it. "Why aren't you in uniform?" the second officer asked abruptly, his tone accusatory. "If you're really a cop, why are you dressed like this?" He gestured vaguely at the hoodie and jeans, as if those clothes somehow invalidated everything else. The man sighed inwardly. This wasn't the first time he'd been questioned about his appearance. Off-duty cops don't always walk around in uniform. It's not practical, especially when they're just living their lives outside of work. But explaining that to these officers felt pointless. They didn't want answers. They wanted justification. The dashboard camera continued rolling, silently capturing every moment. The man kept glancing at it, finding a strange comfort in knowing the encounter was being documented. He'd installed it for moments like this, not because he expected trouble, but because he understood how quickly misunderstandings could spiral out of control. And right now, he couldn't shake the feeling that this situation was teetering dangerously close to the edge. "Can you tell me why I was pulled over?" he asked finally, trying to steer the conversation back to basics. Surely, there had to be a reason: a broken taillight, speeding, something. But the officers exchanged a quick glance and neither answered directly. Instead, they kept circling the car, asking more questions, making vague accusations. It was like they were fishing for something, anything to justify pulling him over. In the first place, the man's frustration was starting to bubble beneath the surface. He wasn't angry, not yet, but he was getting tired. Tired of having to prove himself, tired of feeling like he had to defend his presence in his own neighborhood. Most of all, he was tired of the unspoken biases that seemed to follow him. Wherever he went, even when he wore a badge, and then came the moment that made his blood run cold. One of the officers leaned down, resting his hands on the car door frame, and said something that cut deeper than anything else. "You know," he muttered, loud enough for the dash cam to pick up, "we see guys like you causing problems all the time, always stirring up trouble where there isn't any." The words landed like a punch to the gut. The man froze, staring straight ahead. He didn't say anything, not because he didn't have a response, but because he knew better. Arguing wouldn't change their minds. It would only give them more ammunition. So he bit his tongue, focusing on keeping his breathing steady. His hands relaxed on the steering wheel. Inside, though, his mind was racing. These were fellow officers, men who supposedly shared his commitment to justice and fairness. Yet here, they were treating him like a suspect, a threat, someone unworthy of trust or respect. It wasn't just frustrating, it was infuriating. And the worst part, he knew this wasn't personal. This wasn't about him as an individual. It was about the color of his skin, the assumptions people made before they even knew his name. As the minutes dragged on, the man began to feel trapped, not physically, but emotionally. He was caught between two worlds, the world of law enforcement, where he dedicated years of his life to serving others, and the world of prejudice, where none of that mattered. For the first time in a long time, he felt powerless. All he could do was sit there, answer their questions, and hope the situation would resolve itself before it got worse. But deep down, he knew this wasn't going to end anytime soon. Not until he found a way to break through the wall of suspicion surrounding him. And as the officers continued their relentless questioning, he realized he might have to play his trump card sooner rather than later. Because if they truly didn't recognize him, or worse, if they simply didn't care, he needed to remind them exactly who they were dealing with. The tension inside the car was thick enough to cut with a knife. The man could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, each heartbeat louder than the last. He'd done everything right so far, kept his hands visible, answered their questions respectfully, even popped the trunk when they asked. But none of it seemed to matter. The officers weren't letting up. If anything, they were doubling down, their suspicion growing with every passing second. One of them leaned closer to the car window again, his flashlight still trained on the driver's face. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered sharply, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. The man hesitated, taken aback by the sudden escalation. He hadn't expected this. Sure, traffic stops could get tense, but being asked to step out of the car felt like crossing into dangerous territory. He glanced at the dashboard camera once more, its red light blinking steadily as it recorded everything. For a brief moment, he wondered if the officers even realized it was there. Did they think they were off the record, or did they simply not care? Either way, the presence of the camera gave him a small sense of reassurance. Whatever happened next, at least there would be proof. Taking a deep breath, he unbuckled his seatbelt and slowly opened the car door. He made sure to move deliberately, keeping his movements smooth and non-threatening. He didn't want to give them any reason to misinterpret what he was doing. As he stepped out onto the pavement, the cool night air hit him, sending a shiver down his spine. It wasn't just the temperature that made him uneasy, it was the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The two officers stood a few feet away, their body language unmistakably aggressive. One of them gestured toward the back of the car. "Hands on the hood," he barked, his voice cutting through the quiet neighborhood like a knife. The man complied, placing his palms flat against the cold metal. He could feel their eyes on him, scrutinizing every detail, searching for something, anything that might justify their actions. "Spread your legs," the other officer added, stepping closer. The man did as he was told, his frustration bubbling. Beneath the surface, he knew the drill. He'd seen it happen countless times before. But experiencing it firsthand was different. Being treated like a suspect, like someone who needed to be controlled, left a bitter taste in his mouth. And the worst part? There was nothing he could do about it, not without risking making things worse. As one of the officers began patting him down, the man clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. He could hear the crunch of gravel under their boots, the faint hum of distant traffic, the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Every sound seemed amplified, sharp and clear, as if time itself had slowed down. His mind raced, replaying the events of the past few minutes over and over again. How had it come to this? Why were they treating him like this? And then, just as the pat-down was finishing, one of the officers spoke up. "We're going to need to search your car," he announced, as if it were a foregone conclusion. The man turned his head slightly, meeting the officer's gaze. "On what grounds?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "You haven't given me a reason for pulling me over, and now you want to search my car?" The officer didn't answer directly. Instead, he exchanged a glance with his partner, their unspoken communication clear. They weren't backing down. "It's standard procedure," the first officer said finally, his tone dismissive. "We've got probable cause." Probable cause? The words echoed in the man's mind. What probable cause? He hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't resisted or acted suspiciously. All he'd done was drive home after work just like any other night. Yet here he was, standing in the middle of the street, being treated like a criminal. It was maddening. For a moment, he considered arguing further. He wanted to remind them that he was one of them, that he understood the rules and regulations as well as anyone. But he stopped himself. Arguing wouldn't change their minds, it would only escalate the situation. So instead he took a different approach. "Look," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm an officer too. I know how this works. You don't have probable cause to search my car unless you can show me evidence of wrongdoing." He paused, giving them a chance to respond. When neither officer said anything, he continued, "If you want to proceed, fine, but I'm calling this in. Let's see what Internal Affairs has to say about it." The effect was immediate. Both officers froze, exchanging another quick glance. Up until now, they'd been operating under the assumption that they were dealing with a civilian, a regular person who might not know their rights or how to assert them. But hearing those words, "Internal Affairs," changed the dynamic entirely. Suddenly, they weren't just questioning some random driver. They were potentially facing consequences for their actions. The man reached into his pocket slowly, pulling out his phone. He dialed the number for the local precinct, keeping his movements deliberate and visible. As the call connected, he introduced himself to the dispatcher, explaining the situation and requesting backup. Within minutes, a sergeant arrived on the scene, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "What's going on here?" the sergeant asked, looking from the man to the two officers. The man explained everything: the traffic stop, the accusations, the demand to search his car. He kept his tone professional, sticking to the facts. Meanwhile, the two officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado fading fast, after listening. To both sides, the sergeant turned to the officers. "Do you have probable cause for this search?" he asked pointedly. When neither of them could provide a satisfactory answer, the sergeant shook his head. "This is unacceptable," he said firmly. "Pack it up and get out of here. We'll deal with this later." The relief washing over the man was palpable, but it was tinged with anger and disappointment. He watched as the two officers climbed back into their patrol cars and drove off, leaving him alone with the sergeant. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts and emotions. "You okay?" the sergeant asked finally, breaking the quiet. The man nodded, though he wasn't sure if it was true. Physically, he was fine. Emotionally, he felt drained. He thanked the sergeant for coming and assured him he'd follow up formally in the morning. Then, after exchanging a few more words, he climbed back into his car and drove home. But the night wasn't over yet. Once he was safely parked in his driveway, he sat in the car for a while, staring at the dashboard camera. The red light blinked. Steadily, a silent witness to everything that had happened. He knew what he had to do next. This wasn't just about him, it was about something much bigger. And as he replayed the footage in his mind, he realized this was an opportunity to shine a light on the systemic issues that plagued law enforcement. Issues he dedicated his life to fighting against. With a deep sigh, he grabbed his phone and sent a text to a trusted colleague. "Can you meet me tomorrow? I need to talk." His finger hovered over the send button for a moment before he pressed it. Tomorrow would be soon enough to figure out the next steps. For now, all he wanted to do was walk inside, hug his family, and try to forget for just a little while that the world outside could sometimes feel so heavy. The next morning, the man woke up feeling like he hadn't slept at all. His body was tired, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. The events of the previous night played over and over in his head like a movie on repeat. He lay in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. It wasn't just about the traffic stop itself, it was about what it represented. Being treated like a suspect, being questioned as if he didn't belong in his own neighborhood, being disrespected despite wearing a badge. It was infuriating. But more than anger, he felt a deep sense of disappointment. Not just in the officers who had pulled him over, but in the system he had sworn to serve. Finally, he got out of bed and went through his morning routine. He kissed his kids goodbye as they headed off to school and promised his partner he'd talk about it later. But for now, he needed to focus. Today wasn't just another day, it was the start of something bigger. After breakfast, he sat down at the kitchen table with his laptop and transferred the footage from his dashboard camera onto a flash drive. Watching it again was tough. Every word, every gesture, every loaded comment hit harder the second time around. But he knew this recording was important. It wasn't just evidence, it was proof of something many people refuse to acknowledge. That even those who dedicate their lives to protecting others aren't immune to prejudice. By mid-morning, he met up with his trusted colleague at a quiet cafe near the precinct. They ordered coffee and found a corner booth where they could talk without interruptions. At first, the conversation was casual, filled with small talk about work and family. But soon the tone shifted. The man slid the flash drive across the table and explained what had happened the night before. His colleague listened intently, nodding occasionally but mostly staying silent until the story was finished. "This is serious," the colleague said finally, leaning back in his chair. "You know, this isn't just about you, right? This is about accountability, about showing people what really goes on behind the scenes." The man nodded. He had spent years working within the system, trying to make things better from the inside. But last night had reminded him how far there was still to go. "I'm not doing this for revenge or drama," he said firmly. "I'm doing it because it's the right thing. If we don't call attention to these issues, nothing will ever change." Together they came up with a plan. First, he would submit the footage to Internal Affairs along with a formal complaint against the officers involved. Then he would share his story publicly, not to shame anyone, but to spark a conversation. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Speaking out always came with risks, especially when it involved calling out colleagues. But he also knew it was necessary. Change never happened without courage, and he was ready to take that step later that afternoon. He walked into the precinct and handed over the flash drive to Internal Affairs. The investigator assigned to the case listened carefully as he recounted the details of the traffic stop. When he mentioned the dashboard camera footage, the investigator raised an eyebrow. "That'll help," he said simply, jotting down notes. The man left the office feeling a mix of emotions, hopeful that justice might prevail, but bracing himself for pushback. He knew not everyone would see it his way. Some would dismiss it as a misunderstanding, while others might accuse him of exaggerating. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the truth. Word spread quickly once the footage landed on the desks of Internal Affairs. Within hours, whispers began circulating throughout the department. By the end of the day, nearly everyone knew what had happened, or at least some version of it. Opinions were divided. Some officers rallied around him, praising his decision to come forward and demanding accountability for the two men who had crossed the line. Others, however, weren't so supportive. A few muttered under their breath that he should have let it slide, that making a big deal out of it would only divide the force further. He tried not to let the criticism bother him, but it stung nonetheless. It was hard enough dealing with the incident itself. Hearing backlash from colleagues made it feel like salt in an open wound. Despite the mixed reactions, the investigation moved forward. Internal Affairs reviewed the footage multiple times, comparing it to the statements provided by both sides. It didn't take long for them to reach a conclusion. The two officers had acted improperly. Their behavior during the traffic stop violated protocol, ignored basic courtesy, and perpetuated harmful stereotypes. In short, they had abused their authority. Both were suspended without pay and required to undergo sensitivity training, a slap on the wrist compared to what many felt they deserved, but still a step in the right direction. While relieved that the situation had been addressed officially, the man couldn't shake the frustration lingering beneath the surface. Disciplinary action was one thing, but real change required more than suspensions and workshops. It required a shift in mindset, a commitment to rooting out bias and holding everyone accountable, no matter their rank or reputation. And that kind of transformation wouldn't happen overnight. Determined to keep pushing for progress, the man decided to share his story publicly. He reached out to local journalists and community leaders, explaining why transparency was crucial. "This isn't about me," he told them during interviews. "It's about shining a light on the cracks in our system. If we ignore them, they'll only get worse." His words resonated with people. Within days, his story went viral, sparking conversations across social media and beyond. People shared their own experiences of discrimination and called for reforms in policing practices. For the first time in a long time, it felt like momentum was building toward meaningful change, but speaking out came with its own set of challenges. The man received messages of support from strangers who thanked him for his bravery. Yet he also faced hostility from those who disagreed with his stance. Some accused him of betraying his fellow officers, while others dismissed his experience as an isolated incident. He read every message, good and bad, knowing that engaging with criticism was part of the process. Still, it was exhausting. There were days when he questioned whether it was worth it, whether speaking up would actually make a difference. But then he remembered why he'd started this journey in the first place, not for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. As weeks turned into months, the impact of his actions became clearer. Community forums were organized to discuss police reform, drawing crowds of concerned citizens eager to contribute ideas. Local lawmakers introduced bills aimed at increasing accountability and transparency within law enforcement. Even within the department, attitudes began to shift. Officers started having honest conversations about bias and privilege, acknowledging the need for change even if they weren't sure how to achieve it. Through it all, the man remained steadfast. He continued advocating for reforms, using his platform to amplify voices that often went unheard. He spoke at town hall meetings, wrote op-eds for newspapers, and collaborated with organizations dedicated to improving community police relations. Each step forward was small, but together, they added up to something significant. Looking back on that night, he realized how much it had changed him, not just as an officer, but as a person. It had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about the world he lived in and the profession he loved. But it had also shown him the power of resilience and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew the road ahead would be long. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Hopeful that maybe, just maybe, the cracks in the system could be repaired and that he could play a role in making that happen. Months had passed since that fateful night, but its impact lingered in ways the man hadn't fully anticipated. What started as a routine traffic stop had snowballed into something much bigger, a catalyst for change, not just within his department, but across the community. The story of an off-duty officer being pulled over and treated like a suspect had struck a nerve, sparking conversations about race, bias, and accountability in law enforcement. And while progress was slow and often frustrating, the man couldn't deny the sense of purpose he felt. Every day brought new challenges. Some days were filled with hope, like when he attended meetings where leaders from different backgrounds came together to brainstorm solutions. Other days were harder, especially when he faced resistance from colleagues who didn't share his vision. There were moments when he wondered if it was all worth it. Was he making a difference, or was he just shouting into the void? But then he'd remember the messages he received from ordinary people, parents thanking him for standing up, young kids saying they wanted to be like him when they grew up, and it reminded him why he kept going. One evening, after another long day at work, the man sat down at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee. His partner walked in and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've been carrying this weight for so long," she said softly. "Don't forget to take care of yourself, too." He nodded, appreciating her words more than she knew. She was right. It wasn't easy balancing advocacy with everyday life. But deep down, he knew he wouldn't have it any other way. This fight wasn't just about justice. It was about leaving the world better than he found it for his kids. For their future, the following week, he was invited to speak at a community forum organized by local activists. The event was held in a packed auditorium, with rows of chairs filled with people eager to hear what he had to say. As he stood behind the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, he felt a mix of nerves and determination. These were the people counting on him, the ones who believed change was possible. He took a deep breath and began. "I didn't set out to become an advocate," he admitted, his voice steady but sincere. "I'm just someone who loves my job and believes in doing what's right. But sometimes life throws you curveballs. Sometimes you find yourself in situations that force you to look in the mirror and ask, what kind of person do I want to be? What kind of world do I want to help build?" He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent except for the occasional rustle of papers or the creak of a chair. "That night changed me," he continued. "It showed me how fragile trust can be, even between those of us who wear the same badge. It reminded me that no matter how hard we try, none of us are perfect. We all carry biases, assumptions, blind spots. The key is recognizing them and having the courage to confront them." As he spoke, he shared stories from his own journey, not just the incident itself, but the lessons he'd learned along the way. He talked about the importance of listening, really listening, to people whose experiences differed from his own. He emphasized the need for transparency, urging departments to adopt policies like mandatory body cameras and independent oversight boards. And most importantly, he stressed the value of empathy, the idea that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background or circumstances. By the time he finished speaking, the audience erupted into applause. People lined up afterward to shake his hand, thank him for his honesty, and share their own stories. One elderly woman approached him with tears in her eyes. "You're giving us hope," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for not staying silent." Her words stayed with him long after the event ended, fueling his resolve to keep pushing forward. But it wasn't just public appearances that kept him busy. Behind the scenes, he worked tirelessly to implement reforms within his department. He collaborated with internal affairs to develop training programs focused on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. He advocated for stricter consequences for misconduct, arguing that accountability was essential for rebuilding trust. And he encouraged open dialogue among officers, creating safe spaces where they could discuss difficult topics without fear of judgment. Not everyone agreed with his methods. Some colleagues accused him of rocking the boat, of prioritizing politics over policing. "You're making us look bad," one officer grumbled during a heated meeting. The man didn't shy away from the criticism. Instead, he leaned into it, using it as an opportunity to explain his perspective. "We're not here to protect our image," he replied calmly. "We're here to serve the community. If we lose sight of that, we've already failed." Slowly but surely, his efforts began to pay off. Officers who had once dismissed him as overly idealistic started coming around, realizing that reform wasn't about pointing fingers, it was about improving the system for everyone. Community members noticed the shift too. Trust, though still fragile, began to rebuild. Neighbors who had once avoided interactions with police now felt comfortable approaching them with concerns. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and that was enough to keep the man motivated. In quieter moments, he allowed himself to reflect on how far he'd come. That night on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard had tested him in ways he never imagined. It had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and the world he lived in. But it had also shown him the power of resilience, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the potential for change even in the face of adversity. One evening, as he tucked his kids into bed, they asked him a question that caught him off guard. "Dad, are you famous?" they asked innocently. He chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from his youngest child's face. "No, sweetheart," he said with a smile. "I'm just someone trying to make things better." They didn't fully understand what he meant, but that was okay. Someday they would dot. As he turned off the light and closed their bedroom door, he felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Life wasn't perfect, and neither was he. But he was exactly where he was meant to be, fighting for a future where everyone, regardless of the color of their skin or the uniform they wore, could feel safe, respected, and valued. And in that moment, that was enough.